My name is Rodolfo Rivera Munoz. As most of you know who have watched the program previously, I am the producer of the program. There is a Munoz reunion coming up in Comanche Park here in San Antonio next month on August the 15th. And I will get back to that and tell you more about that shortly. For now, I think it is critical to tell you more about myself. And in this regard, let me tell you openly that I do this fully anticipating that all these matters that I have been discussing on this program will be in issue in litigation that will be forthcoming hopefully soon. So before I lose you, because you cannot figure out what this has to do with anything relevant to the situation in San Antonio, I am going to show you why it has everything to do with San Antonio and with all the people of San Antonio. It has to do with the fact that San Antonio is making history, and it is doing so without even understanding what the elements are that are going to make that history. You are acting pretty much the way you do in your elections. You don't know much more than a few of you that are the leaders of the media and all the money, that 1% of yours that has control of all the money and all the media and so forth and so on. It is that 1% who also knows what the fight here taking place between me and them is. And I say me, and it sounds arrogant, I understand that. But like in everything else that I do, there's a need to not paint with a overly broad brush with this on this matter, because there are repercussions, and if the repercussions fall upon me, I've been able to deal with that, and I can continue to deal with that. Whereas if I do something that adversely affects somebody else, it will be something that results that I can much less tolerate and deal with. So that the way I get you back to relevance, by telling you that it has to do with what I have always been about for the last 20 or more years. Who and what I am is all about identity. Let me tell you that that is also what family reunions are all about. And from everything that I can see, from everything that I know, it looks like the Munoz reunion coming up in a couple of weeks is going to be quite successful. And the reason for that, or a large part of the reason for that, a large part of the credit for successfully bringing it about, goes to El Primo Jesse Munoz. Upon my asking of him directly if that I might say on this program or in litigation might surprise him, was asked the question by me as to whether or not we were still in the same positions vis-a-vis identity that we were back in the late 80s, 1990s, and early 2000s, when the Munoz Munoz versus Kelly Air Force Base class action was still taking place. Having a discussion with my cousin Jesse on the phone, he made it clear that he didn't see where I was misrepresenting any facts. And in response to my question about identity, his response was that yes, he is still Hispanic. And so therefore the positions as to identity are the same. Those of you that have been watching the program will remember that I have at several times throughout the program over the last 20 or so years have disclosed the fact that my first cousins, Manuel and Jesus Munoz, were the lead plaintiffs in the class action. And that in fact my cousin, who is not now deceased, Manuel, was really very instrumental in getting me to come to San Antonio for the purpose of pursuing that litigation. I filed it administratively, but I was dismissed because of the issue of identification. And the sole explanation that I ever got was that by Manuel of, you know what, primo? I am American, y ya, he told me. And that was his way of explaining that the way he understood it and the way perhaps the rest of the class may have understood it, they were all Hispanics. I don't know about that last part of the issue. I don't know, even today, having reviewed again the decisions of the local federal courts and the Fifth Circuit and the U.S. Supreme Court, I don't know that anybody during that entire process so much as came close to articulating what made either Manuel Munoz or myself correct as to identity. My position was then, and it remains now, that I am Indian. And the reason I am Indian has to do to a large extent with what I've already told you about in this presentation here today. I'm showing you a certified copy of the original divorce decree granted April 25, 1953 in the District Court of Claybert County, Texas. And this is the divorce decree between my father, Mauricio Munoz, and my mother, Leonor Rivera. And what I wish to emphasize now, what I need to emphasize now, is that the property in issue was that very lot that my father had gone to my grandmother and told my grandmother, if you'll give me permission, I will build Leonor a house and raise a family and take care of her forever. And so therefore, I'm asking your permission to allow me to marry her and live with her the rest of my life. And as I said, that was all that was required. At the time, the authorities of the invader Americans did not even themselves feel that they yet had cause to impose their rules upon those Indians that my people still were. Even though we're talking about sometime between 1900 and the end of World War II, even during this period of time, the authorities, your government was not in that area yet sufficiently established to say, hey, these are the rules that we're going to apply to everybody else. They did not know, they did not have them written down, they did not apply them to us because they didn't understand how they were going to do that yet. Certainly, the law applicable to land and ownership of land in 1953 at the time of the divorce was the same law that applies today. And yet, I was one of those children of my parents' divorce, which the court was supposedly taking into account, trying to ascertain what the best interest of that child, who was me then, was. Before I tell you what happened, let me tell you that only last year, and you will remember that I made a program to that effect. I made a program as I was trying to ascertain what had happened to the title of that lot at 225 East Ella, where me and my siblings were born in Kingsville. And in that program, I explained that it was only when I was in California that sometime before I was 20 years old, perhaps I had left Texas a couple of years prior to that, maybe 4 or 5 years prior to that. But by then my oldest brother Apolonio, had returned to Kingsville, and he wanted to use the lot on which we were born, which everybody still recognized was ours. He wanted to use that lot for purposes of obtaining a loan to improve the house that was still standing upon it. Upon approaching the bank told him, sure, if the land is yours like you say it is, all you have to do is bring me the title and you got a loan. I'm assuming, because my oldest brother is also now deceased, that that's when he first ascertained that he had no title. Not only did he not have a title, but nobody in the family had a title. Not only did nobody in the family had a title, but nobody in the family had ever even been a party in any dealing having to do with title. Not only did nobody in the family had ever been a party to something having to do with the transfer of title, but my mother's birth certificate, upon looking at it again at that time, was ascertained to have been created for the first time in 1945, which was the year of my birth. So that in 1945, my mother got one of my uncles and the reverend of the church which he attended to at that time to come forward and testify on her behalf that she had been born back in 1911 in Kingsville to people who were from Kingsville, and so forth and so on. And so that my mother only becomes even reflected in the records of your government only at the point where my father, being more counseled by European influences at the King Ranch, sought a lawyer. And only at that point did a record, albeit indirectly again, come about, which concludes by giving me and my siblings an interest in that lot until we reach the age of 16. That is unusual. That doesn't make any sense. My father had come in and requested permission from my grandmother to build my mother a house. And having done that and having lived on there until 1953, or maybe a year or so before that when they separated, now wanting a divorce, my dad simply said, I need to walk away from it. I don't have an interest in the house. The house belongs to my wife. And the only one that I got that I ever obtained an interest in that property through was the grandmother, her mother, Leonor's mother. So the judge, looking at these facts, is confronted with what? He is confronted with evidence that he knows from the circumstances, tells him that my mother and my grandmother and the Riveras were Indians. And as a judge in Clayburgh County in 1953, he still adheres to that understanding that, hey, Indians cannot own title. That's the reason why the land is ours. So how can I, which is what would have happened normally were my mother a white woman, how can I, the judge is asking himself, have the land revert back to its rightful owner? How can I give it back to for whom it's in the best interest to have? Everything that judge was doing dictated that he should have told, the record formally said, this land goes back to its owner, to its rightful owner, Leonor Rivera Munoz. But under the circumstances, because he knew that she was Indian, that my ancestors prior to that point were Indians, he said instead, I give Leonor Rivera, the plaintiff he called her at that time, the plaintiff, a life estate until the kids reached the age of 16. The reason it was so important that I called Jesse, because I needed to consult with him to try to put the situation in a way that makes more sense. And I'm only going to get to that point if I work at it carefully. And that is what I am trying to do right now. Because I need to tell you that both Jesse Munoz and Manuel Munoz are honorable people. Manuel, insofar as he's deceased, was at all times honorable. They were hard-working raza that were convinced and committed to the cause which they pursued against Kelly Air Force Base for discrimination. The dispute between me and them was all about identity. I knew that identity was going to be critical, and regretfully, because I was just starting to practice, I did not know enough to pull my clients At that time, Manuel Munoz and Jesse Munoz were my clients. And I needed to pull them aside and tell them, look, this is the way it's going to proceed. This is the way it has to proceed. We have to establish certain causes, certain elements of the cause of action in court. And in order to do that, I have to tell you what I understand are the requirements. Just as I would do in a criminal matter, I have an obligation as a lawyer to tell Manuel Munoz and Jesse, look, you are the clients. I have to do what you feel is within your prerogative and you feel that you must do. That if you adhere to an identity of Hispanic and that's the way you want to be because you think that you can only be American if you're Hispanic, then that's all right. It's incumbent upon me, however, to tell you whether or not that is going to make a cause of action in court. It's incumbent upon me to explain to you as the class members that an element of the cause of action is going to be that we're going to have to establish that there was a class animus. That the reason that Kelly Air Force Base was discriminating against you was because of X, Y, and Z or whatever. In our case, the issue was your identity. Why are they discriminating against all of those of you that they discriminated against you? Were they discriminating against you because of your religion? That would be a violation, adequate to establish a cause of action. Were they discriminating against you because you were black? That would establish a cause of action. But if you say that they're discriminating against you because you are Hispanic, what is that? Is that race? Or is there some other? We know even now, even just perhaps about 20 years after it happened, we know a lot more about what goes into these definitions. But try to understand it even at that time. What exactly is it that you're complaining about? What is the animus, the basis that makes the Americans in control of Kelly Air Force Base discriminate against you? Don't tell me that they're discriminating against you because you are Americans. If you're going to say that, is that like saying that you're shorter than they are and therefore that's the discrimination? Well, whatever it is that you're saying that's the basis of the discrimination, you have to anticipate it. You have to prepare a case. And so the lawyer has to help his clients do that. And he has to tell his clients, look, these are the elements of what we're going to need. We are going to have to establish that we are a race or we have some other element that is distinguishable from the rest of the population at Kelly Air Force Base, which is not being discriminated against and against whom we're being compared. What I have always needed to do was to be able to explain to Manuel Munoz, all right, this is the difference of opinion. You and I differ. Just the way the other lead plaintiff, Jesse Munoz, is today. Today, within the last couple of days, I called him and I asked him, hey, are we still in the same situation? He said, yes, primo. We didn't yell at each other or anything like that. We know, we understand why we have our respective convictions as we do. he is convinced that he is Hispanic, and I have to respect that. I don't agree with it, and there are reasons which make me do what I'm doing. One of the things that Primo Jesse said in our discussion was that Manuel was committed, that he was so committed to the cause in the class action against Kelly Air Force Base that the results of it have contributed to his demise. And I agree, because he was fervently committed. Immediate conclusion that our adversaries immediately pounce upon is, okay, it's no big deal. That is, your commitment to one or the other of those identities is no big deal. You're wrong. You're wrong. Manuel Munoz exercised everything he could. He did his best. He worked himself. He worked himself to death, fighting against that discrimination that was there, that it could not be successfully made was not due to anything that he did, anything inappropriate that he did. He fought the best he could all the way as long as he could. By the same token, my dispute with Primo Jesse, I still have the same dispute. He's still Hispanic. Like, so is the greatest majority of the people in San Antonio. Am I the only one that's right? I may be the only one that voices it the way I do, but it is because it is so important that it was always critical for me to try to continue to get to this point. To get to this point where I now intend to attend the Munoz reunion, and I intend to attend the Munoz reunion knowing full well that this program is going to be airing that same month of August 2015 that the reunion is going to be taking place. And the reason that I can do that is because I understand that Jesse and Manuel Munoz are honorable people. They were honorable people then, and they remain honorable people. And the fact that I consider it absolutely imperative that the world understand what I am arguing just tells me that there is much more that I yet need to do in order to convince people. In order to convince people that it is a critical distinction. And you cannot, the way I understand it, the way I believe it, you cannot be American and Indian at the same time. Because the Americans never wanted it that way. Because the Americans all the way up until the present do not want it that way. That is why the Americans still have some of our people, some of the people who were here just the way my ancestors were here. My ancestors were here before Pinche Columbus got off the boat the first time, the very first time in the Caribbean. Even before then, my ancestors had already been here for centuries. And that is the case with many, I call them nations. The Americans call them tribes. But many of those tribes also were millions, constituted maybe thousands of people that constituted just as much of a nation as Pinche Spain or England or France at that time. So that what changes anything is again the same thing that has been happening since the pinche Europeans in England learned how to print. Knowledge, understanding, a reporting. You have to understand what the facts are in order to adequately argue them. You now have all this Indian activists running around crazy, wanting to be the first ones across the line to say, hey, now I am Indian. But they don't know what Indian is. They don't know what they are going to argue should be done. Mind you, I am no better prepared in that respect, but that is because I don't think that one person, any one person, or any group should alone decide the future or the destiny of the autochthonous people to all of the Americas that the pinche European invaders are on the verge of exterminating. I don't think that if you can change it around, that any one person can tell the rest of all those that claim that they have an interest now, that one group can tell the other group, or one individual can tell the entire other invaders that, okay, here's what you have to do. Give me, billions, and I'm okay. You're all right. You can continue doing what you're doing. That's not going to work. That's the only reason I still hesitate in doing some of the things that I do on this program. Because I have to consider what I can do. I have to consider whether or not, if I'm going to go into court, what is it that I'm going to do? Is it something that stands a chance, or what? Now, mind you, I have to now explain also that my abiding respect for class members Manuel Munoz and Jesse Munoz does not apply to somebody, although the circumstances are similar. It doesn't apply to somebody like His Honor, the federal judge Orlando L. Garcia. Orlando L. Garcia, I have now no option but to tell the world that he is a Hispanic, knowing what being a Hispanic is. He knows these legal issues I am trying to raise. He understands them. And understanding them, he is applying them against me from the bench. From the federal bench that your society gave him. From there, he's saying, Munoz, I know what you're doing. It is because I know what you're doing, Munoz, Orlando Garcia is saying. It is because I know what you are doing that I'm going to stop you. That I'm going to rule against you. And that I'm going to fight you every time that you come in front of my Hispanic court. Because that is the kind of Hispanic he is. He is the kind of Hispanic that ex-Secretary of Health and Human Resources Henry Cisneros is. Henry Cisneros writes, publishes papers saying, I understand from where we come, and we Hispanics came into being when the Europeans arrived. He understands that he doesn't have any explanation for why perhaps one European coming in and getting lost within millions and millions of Indians, why that one European automatically changes the identity of everybody else. He hasn't said that, but he's not worried about that. Both Orlando Garcia and Henry Cisneros understand that where the power lies. They understand that the power is over there. And there's no need for them to be with Munoz. And regretfully, the world is very much in that similar situation. So that I need, like I always needed, to be very careful and say, look, I understand that my head is on the chopping block, so to speak. I understand where the risk is. And I'm undertaking it, and that's okay. But I need to be very careful that I don't inadvertently drag somebody in with me just because I don't want to be by myself. It is obvious, it is inescapable to see it. There is an awful lot taking place here. I have said it previously, I say it again. The state of Texas is a fraud. It's a fraud because the Alamo was a fraud. The Alamo was a fraud because within 15 years from their arrival, 15 years after the Americans started coming here, they proclaimed themselves the people from here. How ignorant do we have to be to buy that yet? To still accept that? But I have to sit back and take a deep breath and try to control my emotions, because it's not as easy to understand, obviously. Otherwise, the Munoz plaintiffs that I was working with would have understood it. But then otherwise, I would have understood it. Isn't that what is taking place? Isn't that what continues to take place? Yes, we were confused, more so some than others. But the lawyers understood it. The lawyers understand it presently. Judge Orlando L. Garcia, that Hispanic that rubbed it in my face, rubbed my nose to the mud of the legal fiction that the Americans, and in particular the American judiciary under the lead of the U.S. Supreme Court, is still today creating. It is fabricating. I am sorry. I don't want to be this anti-American that end up being. But that last part tells the whole truth. I end up being what the invaders, the people that were so hungry for everything that we had, that are still just salivating over completing everything. And maybe it's no longer all of you, but it is definitely that 1% that controls everything, that is still committed to, hey, they've got to just get as much as they can before the whole thing collapses. They don't care that it's going to collapse. They don't care that they can see every day more and more evidence. It is more and more inescapable to realize that we're heading over an abyss, over a cliff, because the money and the power and everything keeps getting concentrated in fewer and fewer people. But that started happening the moment you got off the ship. The moment Columbus said with 100 people we could make them do whatever we wanted to, that philosophy is still in place. You still believe that what you articulated later, what your people, what the Europeans started to articulate after they made contact with our people, after they came here, it was after they'd been here a couple of 100 years that they came to understand, you know what, these Indians have something going for them. It is a better form of government, that government understand, that government realize that it is nothing without their consent, that it is those individuals, not a king anointed by God, the way the Roman Catholic Church used to say, not an individual, not a hierarchy of people, not a group, but the people out there. Individual rights. The Americans have published it all over the world, but they yet don't understand it. You don't understand it. Because if you understood it, then it would be impossible for you to still have Indians on Indian reservations. How can you today have Indians on Indian reservations who have rights subservient to you, the way your U.S. Supreme Court says, the way the law of the land that you adhere to says? How can there be Indians on reservations who have limited rights, which it is the prerogative of your American judiciary to say what their extent is, to say when, how, and where they may exercise those rights. And it is your legislature, it is the U.S. Congress who can tomorrow declare reservations no longer in place. They no longer exist. That's all they have to say. How can that be the law? And how can that be under the rule of law? Pursuant to the very same things that you are taught in high school, that you are taught over and over and over, that is the basis of why you go to Vietnam, why you sent me to Vietnam. You sent me to Vietnam to tell those people over there that we were a constitutional democracy. That meant that over here everybody respects the individual right of everybody to participate in their government on an equal basis. That those are elements of the rule of law. Except you say, and you've always said, except for the Indian people. Now you have a black president, and you've had some Indians running around, people saying that they are Indians. You had a U.S. senator who said he was an Indian, and at the same time that he was a senator, he had a brother on some reservation in Colorado, I believe. Look at the incongruency, look at the blatant contradiction and the inability of us to understand it. What I needed to understand is what I understand now. I needed to understand that so that I could have taken more control of the Munoz versus Cali Air Force Base class action. I don't know how I was even taken off the case. And your U.S. judiciary, your federal courts, this is a case that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Your federal courts do not themselves understand, because all they have cared about ever since Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823 is that your legal system come up with a common law that allows your American invaders to become the people from here. And in order to become the people from here, you have to finish exterminating me. You have to finish exterminating Indians like me. Indians who understand who they are, understand that their ancestors, my ancestors. That is why I told you about my mother and the maternal side of the family. The Riveras owned everything in this part of the world because they were a people who owned it all. And your ancestors, the Americans, James Bowie, Davy Crockett, Travis, and even that pinche John Wayne with old Betsy up on those movie scenes that he shot so often. All of them knew this. All of them knew that, and they know that now. They know that we were here. They know that there were Indians here, and they know now that we were human beings. The only ones that didn't know anything were us. We did not know, and we were afraid of your guns, and we were afraid of getting summarily shot in the face between the eyes. Should we just so much say, hey, sorry, senor, I'm sorry, but this is my land. Boom. Here are your rights, and here is your due process, and here's everything. And now we have lawyers who are just like me, and they read the same cases that I do, and they study the same legal history that I do. And what keeps them from understanding the truth is the same thing that keeps the Hispanics identifying as Hispanics. Somehow, somewhere, the Americans stuck their hand into our brain and moved things around and rubbed it all with mud. Made us forget who we are, who we were. Because scientists will tell you that between my grandmother and perhaps even 7 generations before that, you go all the way back then and you compare them with me, and we are the exact same people. We have the exact same human elements, human aptitudes, human abilities. We were that way. We were the equals of the Europeans when they arrived. We were the equals of Columbus when he got off the ship in the Caribbean the first time. That he could kill us because he had a sword and a harquebush doesn't change anything. What they are trying to do now is change it by virtue of making us forget all that happened. By making us believe that that judiciary of the Americans is actually one that operates under the rule of law. I have to tell you unequivocally, no, that is not the case. I am going to continue making these programs as long as I can. I have a serious need to approach several different subjects, such as what the invaders claim was the basis of their acting to, as they say, protect us. They always said that they needed to protect the Indian. And in the course of that, we all know what they did to us. The other one is that what exists in the United States today is that only those people who have been able to grab the power, to assert themselves, to get up and say to the rest of the people, hey, you're going to recognize my rights because I demand it. Only those people have been able to be recognized as equal to the invaders. But perhaps what I have to say more than anything else is I need to complete this thing about the Munoz family. Because I've been afraid of it for a long time. I've been afraid because I don't want to be mad at my own people. And nobody presented this issue more directly than Manuel and Jesse Munoz in the class action. I had to understand everything that I now understand to realize that I played a part in it. I played a part in it because even though I wasn't allowed to fully develop my part in it, Manuel Munoz and Jesse Munoz were right in seeking different counsel, although perhaps they didn't do it the right way. And the courts know that, and that's what's really bad about the courts. But nevertheless, for the Munozes that hopefully will be listening to this, as I've explained, I lived with Manuel Munoz for at least a few months when I first came to San Antonio. I lived there because Manuel Munoz wanted me to come, because he wanted me to file the class action, because he couldn't find anybody else that would do it, because he couldn't put together the entire wherewithal that was required. And so that it came about is due to Manuel Munoz primarily. Jesse, as I think Jesse will tell you, Jesse went along with Manuel. But Manuel was the impetus, the sprouting, the from where it all began, and he was one that took it all the way to the end. I came in having just graduated from UCLA Law School, having just passed the bar, and barely starting out to practice. One of the first things that I remember doing was telling Manuel and the other class members, hey, you have to buy me one of these employment discrimination manuals so that I can study up on it. But even if I had read those volumes from end to end, I still needed the practice. I still needed what I have come to understand after all this. We're now perhaps about 40 years later, 30 years during which I practiced law. And now I understand what every lawyer that represented the class should have understood, and that is that they needed to foresee the fact that the issue of identity was going to be front and center from the beginning, from the get-go all the way to the end, as it in fact was. But you know what? Even though there may have been a lot of lawyers that did a lot of things wrong, there was somebody who you can now look at the reports, look at what they've written, because that is one thing about the American judiciary and the judicial system, is that everything is recorded. And look at those records now, and they don't touch the whole issue of identity. Manuel and I were fighting, we're struggling with that. It is understandable, I now realize, it is completely understandable that Manuel concluded, Primo, I'm an American. How can I be anything else? I too served in the military. I too was sent to Vietnam. And at no time did I tell anybody, hey, wait a minute, I'm an Indian. How can you send me to fight your war in Vietnam if I'm an Indian and you know what the law is? I couldn't say anything because I didn't understand. I didn't know. And so only now, understanding at least as much as I now do, is it possible for me to understand that Primo Manuel really gave his life for the Munoz versus Kelly Air Force Base class action. In closing, I want to tell you a story about an occasion in which we were in the main offices of Eloy Centeno. Eloy Centeno was another client of mine who was way ahead of his time, who understood things that I yet have to understand. And there was a time when Manuel Munoz and Jesse and several other members of the class came into the office where Centeno and I were discussing cases. If I remember correctly, Jose Angel Gutierrez was present at that time. The discussion turned briefly to identity. And I remember, I believe it was Jesse Munoz saying, pues primo, we all know that. We all know that we're all Indian. We all know that La Abuela was all Indian and so forth and so on. But we're now Hispanic. Or something to that effect. Still today, as I've told you earlier, Jesse still says that he's Hispanic. And just don't feel the need to fight him on it so much anymore. Because I understand that my fight is with the judiciary of the Americans. Because I'm a lawyer, I'm still licensed to practice. And perhaps nobody else understands it, but I know what it is. I know what I understand the law to be, and I know how I've pled it, how I've taken it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, how the American judiciary has avoided it. I remember, and I have transcripts being in front of judges, your district court judges here in San Antonio, telling them who I am and why the city of San Antonio doesn't have any jurisdiction over me. And I remember judges, still sitting judges, turning around and asking the city, do you have an argument for claiming jurisdiction over Mr. Munoz? And they didn't have one. They didn't present one. Now, talk about being careful. Talk about working all these years to make sure that I didn't go off and do something crazy. I think it has been long enough. I think I have tried as best I can to allow your government, to allow the American government, the American institutions, the government, the educational institutions, the historians who are still writing as if the legal aspects of the history don't matter. All your society is still actively pursuing the extermination of the Indian.